Lucas Harper sat at a worn wooden table in his tiny apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, clutching a letter in his hands. His fingers trembled, and his heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to drown out the nighttime bustle outside the window. He knew this letter brought nothing good. Inside was a notice of an upcoming court hearing regarding the debts that had accumulated over the past year and a half, debts he had no means to pay. A 26-year-old law student, Lucas had become the sole provider for his family after his father's death. He had to drop out in his third year to take care of his mother, who had been diagnosed with a severe heart condition, and his younger sister Rosie, who dreamed of becoming an illustrator. Their lives had turned into a cycle of medical bills, overdue rent payments, and endless side jobs that never brought in enough money. One evening, his friend and former classmate Josh invited Lucas to an exclusive reception hosted by one of the city's largest law firms. Josh claimed that important people would be there, and it could be an opportunity for Lucas to find some way to change his life. At first, Lucas refused. Such events weren't for him. He felt like an outsider among elegant people in expensive suits, discussing their latest deals, travels, and investments. But Josh convinced him that this was a chance he couldn't afford to miss. That evening, wearing the only decent suit he had managed to borrow from Josh, Lucas went to the reception. The noisy hall, filled with the city's wealthiest people, seemed like something from another world. He stayed in the shadows, observing as guests leisurely sipped champagne and discussed politics, real estate, and the stock market. It was there that he first met Evelyn Blake. She was 68 years old and looked impeccable. Tall, with neatly styled silver hair, wearing an expensive yet understated dress, she radiated calm confidence. When her gaze settled on Lucas, he felt a strange sensation, like she could see right through him. "You don't look like the kind of person who usually attends these events," she said with a slight smile. Lucas hesitated but quickly gathered his thoughts and introduced himself. They started talking, and to his surprise, Lucas found that conversation with her came easily. She didn't ask about his status or financial situation. Instead, they discussed philosophy, literature, and human values. Her keen intellect was striking, and her voice carried the weight of countless stories. By the end of the evening, Evelyn asked for his number. She said she wanted to discuss something important with him. Lucas felt uneasy but gave her his contact information, unaware that this conversation would change his life forever. 3 days later, he received an invitation from her. Evelyn asked him to meet her at her home, a historic mansion in the northern part of the city. Lucas understood that whatever offer she was about to make would be far more than just friendly advice. Evelyn Blake's old mansion towered over the neighborhood, a reminder of a bygone era. Its facade was adorned with intricate stucco, and the massive windows reflected the last rays of the setting sun. Lucas stood at the wrought iron gates, breathing heavily. He felt his heart begin to pound again. He couldn't understand why this meeting unsettled him so much. As soon as he pressed the doorbell, the massive doors swung open, and Evelyn appeared on the threshold, looking just as elegant as she had the day they met. She gestured for him to enter. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading him through the spacious hall into the living room. The room was tastefully furnished, shelves lined with old books, cozy armchairs, and the soft glow of lamps. Lucas felt strangely at ease. "I won't beat around the bush," Evelyn began, pouring herself a bit of wine. "I have an offer that could change your life." Lucas froze. "I'm listening." She paused, studying his face intently. "You've probably already guessed that my interest in you wasn't random. The truth is, I need a companion. Not in a romantic sense, but rather a social one." Lucas frowned but didn't interrupt. "I want to offer you a marriage of convenience," Evelyn continued. In return, I will pay off all your debts, cover your mother's medical treatment, and fund your sister's education. You will never have to worry about money again." The air in the room grew heavy. Lucas stared at her, trying to process what he had just heard. "Why do you need this?" he finally managed to ask. "My reasons are personal," she replied with a slight smile. "But let's just say it's important for me to have someone I can trust. No intrigue, no games. And in return, you'll be free from your troubles." Lucas felt his thoughts racing. This was an offer he couldn't refuse. But could he live with the knowledge that he had entered a marriage not out of love, but out of necessity? "I'll give you time to think," Evelyn said, standing up. "I need your answer in 3 days." As he stepped out of the house, his mind was flooded with questions. This could be his salvation, or the biggest mistake of his life. 3 days had passed, but Lucas was still uncertain about his decision. He had spent sleepless nights contemplating Evelyn's offer. He tried to find a catch, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. She had been completely sincere. When the time for their meeting arrived, he once again stood before her mansion. This time, he felt different, not so much anxious as resolute. As he stepped inside, Evelyn greeted him with a faint smile. "Have you made your decision?" she asked calmly. Lucas took a deep breath. "Yes, I accept." Evelyn studied him carefully, then nodded. "Good. Then let's begin." Lucas and Evelyn were married at the county courthouse a week after his decision. There was no grand ceremony, just a few signatures and the legal confirmation of their union. A few days later, he moved into her mansion, leaving behind a life filled with worries and debt. Lucas quickly realized that his new life was nothing like anything he had known before. Evelyn's mansion was enormous, with high ceilings, massive chandeliers, and expensive antique furniture, each piece seemingly holding a story of its own. Despite its grandeur, the house felt lifeless. The servants were attentive but distant, and Evelyn spent most of her time in her study or the library. In the first few days, he felt like a guest who had been given the keys to a kingdom but had no idea how to use them. Every morning, Evelyn disappeared, leaving him alone with breakfast in a dining room half the size of his old apartment. In the evenings, she reappeared, inviting him to dinner, where they discussed politics, economics, and philosophy, everything except the strange nature of their marriage. But one evening didn't go according to their usual script. "Lucas," Evelyn said, setting her wine glass aside, "don't you think we're keeping each other at a distance?" He froze, his fork hovering in midair. I don't know," he admitted. "This is all a little strange for me." Evelyn studied him intently, as if trying to read his thoughts. "I think we should build at least some form of trust if we're going to live under the same roof. I'm not asking you to pretend to be a loving husband, but at the very least, be present, not just physically." Lucas nodded, trying to grasp what exactly she expected from him. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Evelyn considered for a moment. "Start with something simple. Spend time with me. Tomorrow, I want to go to an art exhibition. Will you come with me?" Lucas wasn't an art enthusiast, but he understood this mattered to her. "Of course." Evelyn smiled, for the first time, not in her usual reserved, polite way, but warmly. The next day, they visited an art gallery in downtown Chicago. It was a whole new world for Lucas, paintings filled with meanings he didn't always understand, people passionately discussing colors, forms, and emotions. Evelyn, however, moved through the space as if it were her home. She explained the significance of the paintings, shared stories about the artists. At some point, Lucas caught himself feeling genuinely interested, not just in the art, but in Evelyn. Her perspective on things, the way she spoke, the quiet strength in her demeanor. That evening at dinner, he initiated the conversation himself. "Have you always been interested in art?" Evelyn smiled. "For many years. When I was younger, I dreamed of being a painter. But life had other plans." "Why?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment. "Because sometimes we have to make choices, not always in favor of our dreams." Lucas suddenly realized that her words resonated with him more than he expected. Their marriage had also been a choice dictated by circumstances. But maybe not the worst one. A few weeks passed, and their relationship truly began to change. Lucas no longer felt like an outsider in the mansion. He had grown accustomed to its rhythm: morning coffee on the terrace, long conversations over dinner, and leisurely walks through the garden. Evelyn, despite her reserved nature, gradually opened up to him. She shared stories from her youth, mused about the world, and laughed at his jokes. Lucas started seeing her not just as a wealthy, influential woman, but as a person with deep emotions, memories, and a vulnerability she rarely revealed. One evening, after attending a formal event where Lucas had accompanied her as her husband, they returned home later than usual. Evelyn looked tired but satisfied. "You handled yourself wonderfully tonight," she said, removing her earrings. "I even noticed Mrs. Caldwell taking an interest in you." Lucas smirked. "That woman is at least 10 years older than you." Evelyn laughed, a light, genuine laugh he had never heard from her before. "Seems like you have a talent for attracting older women." He shook his head and took a step toward her, suddenly catching her gaze. The room fell silent. "Evelyn," he said softly. "Yes." He wanted to say something important but struggled to find the right words. I'm glad I agreed to this." She nodded slowly, her expression composed, but something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite decipher. "So am I, Lucas." Lucas didn't know exactly when their relationship stopped being just an arrangement. Maybe it was that evening when he saw the exhaustion in Evelyn's eyes, or when she trustingly placed her hand on his shoulder after a long day. 2 months had passed. They no longer pretended for the sake of appearances. They had truly become something more to each other than just formal spouses. Lucas didn't just accompany her to events, he started understanding her world. He listened to her stories about the past, asked questions, and took an interest in her business. But one day, their fragile balance was disrupted. That day, Evelyn wasn't feeling well. She canceled all her meetings and spent most of the day in her bedroom. Lucas knocked on her door. "Come in," her voice was softer than usual. He stepped inside and saw her sitting by the window, wrapped in a light cashmere blanket. "How are you?" "Better," she replied gently, but he could see it wasn't true. Lucas sat beside her. "Do you trust me?" Evelyn looked at him with a long, searching gaze. "I do." He covered her hand with his. "Then tell me the truth. What's going on?" She averted her eyes. "It's not just exhaustion, Lucas." The air in the room grew heavy. "The doctors said the illness is progressing. I have less time than I thought." He felt something tighten inside him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to pity me." Lucas took a deep breath. "I don't pity you, Evelyn. I just want to be here." She looked at him. In her eyes, he saw everything: gratitude, fear, but most of all, an affection that had taken them both by surprise. That evening, he stayed with her longer than usual. They sat together, holding hands, saying nothing. Because words weren't necessary. After that night, something changed. The distance they had both carefully maintained was gone. Lucas spent more and more time with Evelyn, not out of duty or obligation, but because he simply couldn't stay away. He began noticing things that had previously escaped him. How she held her breath when the pain worsened. How her fingers trembled as she wrote in her journal. how, at times, a strange expression crossed her face, a mix of sorrow and quiet acceptance. One night, he woke up with a sense of unease. It felt as if he had heard her voice. Getting out of bed, he went to her room and found Evelyn sitting on the floor, leaning against the bed. "Evelyn!" He was by her side in an instant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Just a little dizzy." Lucas lifted her gently and helped her onto the bed. "Why didn't you call me?" She smiled, tired but warm. "I've gotten used to handling things on my own." He looked at her, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite define. "You're not alone, Evelyn." "Not with me." She brushed her fingers lightly against his cheek, a soft, barely there touch. "I know." Lucas slowly covered her hand with his. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. Her voice, usually so steady, wavered. It was the first time she had truly let him see her vulnerability. "I'm here," he said firmly. In that moment, he realized that what he felt for her was far more than just attachment. But could he tell her? Did they even have enough time? He didn't know. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let her go. After that night, everything changed. Their world shrank to warm glances, to quiet conversations in the dark, to touches that spoke more than words. Time was no longer something abstract, it was measured in moments spent together. Lucas didn't think about the future, didn't ask questions. He was simply there. But the illness showed no mercy. Each day, Evelyn grew weaker. She went to the garden less often, spent more time in bed, yet her smile still lit up her face whenever he walked into the room. One evening, as the rain pounded against the windows, she beckoned him closer. "Lucas, promise me something." "Anything," he said softly, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "When I'm gone," she hesitated but continued. "Don't let this pain chain you down. Live. For both of us." Lucas closed his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I don't know how to live without you." Evelyn gave him a faint smile. "You will. Because you're stronger than you think." He leaned in and gently kissed her fingers. "I love you, Evelyn." She didn't answer right away, just ran her fingers over his cheek, memorizing every feature. "I know," she finally whispered. "And it's the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to me." A week later, she was gone. Lucas didn't know how much time they had left together, but he decided not to waste it on fear. Evelyn was his world, and he wanted her final days to be filled with warmth, not the anticipation of the inevitable. They started living as if they had an eternity ahead of them. Evelyn continued taking him to events, even as her strength faded. They read books in the garden, watched old films, laughed at memories, and created new ones. But one morning, everything changed. Lucas woke up and found the bed beside him empty. He searched for her and finally found her in the study, sitting at her desk, holding a sheet of paper. "What are you doing?" He stepped closer. Evelyn looked up at him. "Finishing my affairs." Lucas sat beside her. "You're exhausting yourself. Let me help." She smiled and handed him the paper. "I've already made my decision." Lucas scanned the document and froze. It was her will. "Evelyn, I'm leaving everything to you," she said calmly. A lump formed in his throat. "Why?" "Because you're the only one I trust." He shook his head. "I don't need your money." "I know," Evelyn ran her fingers along his cheek. "But you'll do something good with it." "I'm sure of it." Lucas closed his eyes, pressing her hand against his face. "You know that's not what matters to me." "I know," she sighed. "But I need to know that you won't have to worry about the future." Lucas met her gaze. "My future would be empty without you." Evelyn gave him a faint smile. "Then do me a favor." "Anything." She placed her hand over his. "Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll keep living." not in memories, but truly living. Lucas squeezed her fingers. Evelyn, promise me, Lucas. He felt his heart breaking, but he nodded. I promise. She smiled, then leaned in and kissed him softly. Then I have nothing left to fear. The last days were the most precious and the hardest. Evelyn barely left her bedroom, and Lucas stayed by her side every minute. He read to her the books she loved, brought her flowers, made her favorite tea, and helped her when she was too weak. But most importantly, he simply held her hand. One night, he woke up, sensing an unusual silence. Evelyn was breathing softly, her face calm but too pale. He leaned in closer. Evelyn. She slowly opened her eyes. You're still here, she whispered. Of course. She gave him a faint smile. Lucas. I'm here, my love. With effort, she lifted her hand and traced her fingers along his face. I'm so tired. Lucas closed his eyes, gripping her hand tighter. I know. Her fingers trembled slightly. Do you remember what you promised me? Pain squeezed his chest. Yes. Evelyn looked at him with a long, gentle gaze. Then live, Lucas. Live for both of us. She smiled, just barely, but warmly. And then her fingers went still, her breath faded, and the world became quieter than ever before. Lucas held her hand in his, hunched over her, allowing himself to break, allowing himself to love her until the very end. She left with a smile. She was gone, but she left a part of herself within him. 3 months had passed. Evelyn's mansion was no longer a dark, empty place, soaked in the shadow of loss. Lucas knew she wouldn't have wanted him to live in the past. She wanted him to live. And he tried. At first, it was hard. He would wake up at night, expecting to hear her voice. He would glance over his shoulder, thinking he'd see her smile. Every corner of this house reminded him of her. But he kept his promise. Lucas started working. The money Evelyn had left him went toward a charitable foundation in her name, a foundation dedicated to helping people with terminal illnesses, giving them the chance to spend their final days with dignity. He resumed his studies. He returned to law school, throwing himself into his work with renewed purpose, knowing he now had something to fight for. He was no longer the desperate man that circumstances had once backed into a corner. One day, while walking through the autumn park, he met Rosie, his younger sister, who had stood by him through everything. She smiled as she showed him her new illustrations. They're amazing, Rosie, he said, genuinely admiring her work. She looked at him thoughtfully. You know, Lucas, you've changed. In what way? You look alive. He thought about it. Yes, he still missed Evelyn. He still felt her presence. But now it no longer hurt. Now it was a warm memory. I think you're right, he said, smiling. Rosie took his hand. Evelyn would be proud of you. Lucas looked up at the sky, where sunlight filtered through the branches of the trees. I know.